Great. So today we have a very special speaker who's come all the way from South Wales to be here with us, and is, according to the government, the PHP expert of the UK. I think you regret telling me that.
I do regret telling you that.
So without further ado, I'd like you to warmly welcome Stuart Herbert.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, I should not have told you that. I really should not. Ah. Dear. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. And first of all, can you hear me all at the back? There's quite a lot of fans. All right, excellent. If I get quiet during the talk, do tell me to speak up again. So I'm here to talk about preparing for disasters. I'm not here to talk about preventing them, because none of us can afford that. And the companies that can afford it are at such scale, they can't prevent the disasters anyway. But before we get into that, a little bit about me for anyone who doesn't know me, and I don't have that on this slide. I've got an extensive experience across academia, startups, enterprise, and government projects. I've been doing open source since before the term existed, and I've been doing PHP talks since 2004. These days, I run my own company, Ganbaro Digital, where my job title is Chief Software Archaeologist. Because what's the point of having your own company if you can't have any fun? Yeah? We don't tweet much on Twitter, but do follow us. I'm going to be fixing that over the summer. You can follow me on Twitter, but be warned. I'm very passionate about my causes. I'm very passionate about my hobbies. So if you only have to tech stuff, you may not enjoy following me on Twitter, okay? So just be aware of that. Now this talk is a follow-up to one I gave 12 months ago up in Edinburgh, where I was talking about making applications more robust. And there was a short segment in there about what I'm going to cover tonight, and this talk is expanding on that. The video was going to be online for tonight, but unfortunately, Apple haven't yet shipped all the stability fixes they're promising us. So the videos failed to upload this weekend. But they should be up, once I get back home, I should be able to get them up in time for the weekend. So you'll be able to see the Edinburgh talk in full up there. So I'm here to talk to you about disasters that happen in production. And I want to share with you what I do to my code bases so that I'm ready for those disasters when they happen. So I'm not here to talk about software architecture or anything like that. It's just purely about what you do to your code. And there's a few things behind that, but the most important one of it all is this. How many of you have had to deal with time-critical issues on a production site? Show of hands. Quite a few. Yeah? And when you're doing that, you've normally got someone over your shoulder saying, is it done yet? Is it done yet? It might be a customer, it might be a boss, it might be both at the same time. You know where I'm coming from, yes? Yes. So I've done quite a lot of that over my career. And looking back across those different code bases I've been involved with and have designed outright, there's three things I want from those code bases. There's three outcomes I want. And I'm going to show you how I achieve those in my code bases tonight. That's what I'm going to do with this talk. And there's some underlying principles that are running themes throughout the talk. This is possibly my favorite. I've seen lots of people trying to fix things and going, oh, it must be that, oh, it must be that, and it's not at all, because they didn't have the information they needed to chase down the bug correctly. Its sister, or brother, depending on your point of view, is this one, is where people don't realize they've got a gap, and in their heads, they're filling that gap themselves with information that doesn't actually exist. They're making assumptions, they're jumping to conclusions ahead of time. And you can often end up shipping fixes that make a bad situation worse. Who's done that in prod? I have. Yeah. A few knowing smiles. And there's a third running theme at all through this talk. Are any of you familiar with System 1, System 2 theory for how the brain processes information? Jeremy is. So the basic idea, I'm very, very loosely paraphrasing here, is there's a model that says the brain has two ways of thinking about things. System 1 comes to quick decisions, but it does so by not really considering the information very much. And System 2 will consider all that information, but it's really slow. And it only considers things that System 1 delegates to it. Very, very rough paraphrasing of it. And what happens when people are under pressure is System 2 never gets engaged, or doesn't get engaged enough unless you've practiced it. How many of you are martial artists? Sort of. So you'll be well aware of why you do kata and forms and things like that. So that if you ever needed to use those skills, they're ingrained. You don't have to think about them. Okay? That's the whole point of that. And that's something we'll be seeing throughout this talk as well. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm sharing my experience. As embarrassing as Rick's introduction is, I have actually served on a government project as an official PHP expert, overseeing people you will have heard of. And I'm going to leave it at that. So I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot from people at all sorts of levels. I haven't seen everything. There are going to be things you have seen that I can learn from tonight as well. So let's make this as two-way as possible. There is a room mic to pick you up, but you will have to shout quite a bit because the fans are very well pitched for the microphones. But if we turn them off, you'll all drop dead, I fear, from the heat. Okay. Sound good?
Yes.
Is what you're here for?
Yes.
Good. One day, someone will say no to that question. So let's jump straight into it. The first outcome I want from a code base, I actually want to know there's a problem. And let me explain what I mean by that, because I want to tackle the myth of passive monitoring. There's probably a better phrase for that, but maybe not one I can share on camera. So I've got a question for you. When something's wrong in prod, how do you find out today on your own systems or systems you're involved with? Anybody? Customer tells you. Twitter. Okay. Anything else?
Monitoring while we have unique packets coming out of our applications.
I should have banned you from answering that one. Anything else?
Slack.
Slack. Okay. So who's on Slack? Sorry, no, in that room.
Our applications are on Slack.
Your applications themselves. Okay, right.
The reports.
Okay, right. Okay. So we're going to come on to customers in a moment, but when I go into organizations, there's a common attitude I find with the idea that, oh, we'll just know because everything will be on fire. The idea, a lot of people believe that they use the things that they write and ship. So if it's screwed up, they'll find out themselves. How many of you use whatever it is you work on? A few people? Would you say you used it regularly? Maybe, maybe not. Because that's the point I really want to get across with this, is anyone who says, oh, well, we eat our own dog food or drink our own champagne, whatever the phrase is in vogue at the minute, may not be using it regularly as enough, not as regularly as the customers who are paying for it. So this channel can often be very unreliable, which may reflect why it has actually come up in the room. But the channel that did come up is angry customers. Yeah. I'm going to challenge this one as well, despite what you've all said, because I've done this. Have you, hands up who's done this? Rather than report a bug, you've actually gone and used a competitor's website instead. Yeah? It's a very common behavior. Think of how much effort it takes to report a bug to somebody, especially a firm you haven't got a direct relationship with yet because you've just started, it's software as a service, you've signed up online, you've never talked to a human. A bug report could be the first time you actually talk to them. Getting that bug report together takes time. Convincing the person at the other end you really do have a bug and it's not covered in the help files takes time. A few knowing smiles there. And then getting that through their internal priorities to get it fixed takes time. In this day and age, it's often quicker to solve a problem by taking the business elsewhere. So even this channel is not reliable. Now, those of you who have customers who tell you about things, are you the person the customer talks to? Or is the customer talking to someone else in your organization first? Show of hands. Who directly receives bug reports from customers? The first person the customer talks to? Quite a bit. And who works in organizations where the customer's talking to someone else first? So I'd say that's roughly a 50-50 split. I think that's about fair. So something I've seen, because I've done work with larger organizations, is the engineers may not even know that the customer's reported a problem. Because the person the customer talks to, they could be in a different part of the building. Dedicated customer services, by its nature, can be a noisy function, especially if you're doing telephone support. And as engineers, we want peace and quiet. We want a monastery, don't we? We don't want a busy, I mean, we hate open plan offices as it is, never mind having to sit next to people answering the phone all day. In successful organizations, the people answering the phone or dealing with customer support can be in a different building. And as we are starting to see this trend of remote working, of course, you don't get anyone in the same building. More and more, we're seeing products and services used worldwide. So your customer or the person answering the customer could be in a different time zone to you. And of course, we've still got the holdover from the 90s and the 2000s of people who outsource customer service offshore it as a false economy. And the other reason I want to challenge this channel as a myth is because organizations often end up with teams with competing agendas. And I'm not just saying customer services, because customer service may be attached to sales, and sales is more about selling rather than saying, oh, we can't sell because of bugs. That can sometimes happen. But I've worked in organizations where the engineers weren't told about bugs or weren't allowed to work on bugs because their managers were telling them, we've got to carry on digging through the backlog and getting the features out. I've worked on multiple systems like that. Sometimes engineering's the bad guys. It's not just sales and marketing. So I don't think this channel's reliable either. So in my experience, it pays to cut out all these middlemen to finding out there's a problem with the app. And this is the first part about preparing your app for designing for disaster. We're talking about monitoring, as Jeremy mentioned earlier on. Okay? So when I say monitoring, what does that make you think? Is that your job? Is it someone else's job? Hands up if you think it's your job. Maybe a third. Hands up if you think it's actually someone else's job. It's not your job. Nobody. Oh, a few reluctant hands. Oh. This is an attitude you get from people. Oh, it's DevOps' responsibility. It's not ours. We're developers. That's an attitude. Now, it is DevOps' responsibility if you accept that DevOps is not a bloody job title. I'm not going to turn this into a rant on that by any means. DevOps is about bringing your operators, your sysadmins, and your developers together in a holistic approach. That's what DevOps is about. It's not meant to be a rebranding of old-fashioned system operators, system admins, okay? And when we talk about monitoring, a lot of people think log monitoring. Who monitors their application logs here? Oh, you poor people. Okay. Right. I used to. I don't anymore. I really don't. The reason I used to is I've been doing this for so long. I started in the pre-web industry where log messages were unrecognizable to what we have today. Modern log messages are really not suited for actual application monitoring in detail. How many of you treat your log output the same way you treat your REST APIs or your class interfaces? How many of you do that? Nobody. No? I mean treating them with Semver and all the rest. No, not even Jeremy. Okay? When was the last time you wrote out what your log messages were in your app, when you documented your app? Nobody. Well, Rick, maybe. A log dictionary? Yeah, that's a nice old-fashioned approach. I like it.
It's something that often falls on deaf ears on everybody around me, but I come from the same era as you.
Yes.
I am older and for example, when you throw an error, you've got the ability to have an error code.
Yes.
They should be absolutely unique throughout the system.
Yes.
And therefore have a dictionary available.
Yes.
Whenever you've issued that number.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you ever get that number quoted back to you, you know exactly the source of the problem.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I know I document error codes.
Yeah.
View IDs. So they are.
With UIDs, right. you are rare. It's so rare these days, and of course, with us all consuming third-party code more and more these days, when was the last time you used a piece of third-party code that documented its log messages? Yeah, documentation is a dying art. I mentioned Semver earlier. See, log messages, developers, in my experience, they treat them as something for them personally. They don't even treat them for fellow developers in the room. And so they'll quite happily add and remove log messages whenever they're working on a problem. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just the nature of how log messages are today. Jeremy mentioned parsable logs. Modern logs aren't machine readable like old-fashioned logs used to be. They're really not. How many of you do structured logging? A few people? Maybe a quarter? Okay. I'm going to talk a lot more about structured logging as we get further into the talk. I do structured logging, but it's still not something I'm happy monitoring on because it's not an additive fact. It's a statement. It's not a numerical thing. It's a piece of text that says something happened, maybe. That's it. And here's the other thing with monitoring. And this may partly undermine the second half of the talk, but we'll cover that as well as we get through it. Logging isn't reliable. How many of you have been told, oh, there's a problem in production? If your first question is, what do the logs say? And the message comes back saying, oh, there aren't any logs. Yeah? A lot of knowing smiles there. We've all been there. We've all done it. But that's got consequences. Those of you who monitor your logs, if you use systems like Nagios, fundamentally, they're regexes looking for a piece of input to react to. If there's no input, that regex cannot fire. So would your log system notice if nothing was happening? Would it know the difference? Those of you who do logging, monitoring of messages, would it do that?
No, because you're only looking for the trigger positive output,
Yeah.
not the negative lack of.
Yes.
And so the lack of something is always hard to spot and infer.
It is with logging, yes. So, as I mentioned before, logs disappear during emergencies. It's surprising how many emergencies are caused by your logs. Not being able to write to them, disk full, that sort of thing.
Classic.
Yeah?
Absolutely classic.
These are all things we've seen. Another thing is, logs are temporary. You don't keep your log, right, you shouldn't be keeping your logs around for a long period of time for many reasons. And as your organizations and your products grow, the sheer volume of logging means you're starting to get storage problems. Although thankfully storage costs even in the cloud are coming down, which helps a bit with that. But one thing I do when I'm troubleshooting an app is I want to see what happened at the same time. Sometimes I want to see what happened at the same time the last week or the last month. I'm sometimes looking for trends and patterns rather than specific log messages. And that can be very helpful in diagnosing problems at scale. And here's another thing. You've only got so much bandwidth to write these logs down. You've only got so much network bandwidth. You've only got so much disk bandwidth. And your laptops are faster than whatever your production app's running on for this. So you can run out of I/O. I've seen very large projects do this. And as a result, what happens is the amount you're logging gets less and less and less until you're logging the absolute minimum you can get away with. At which point you've got so little to monitor, your monitoring will fall apart from that reason alone.
Syslog's got it built in. If you end up with too much bandwidth, it just halves it and just puts a summary.
Yes, it can do that. Yeah. So what can you monitor then if logs aren't a good idea? What's left in your apps today? Chris? Network bandwidth?
CPU usage?
CPU usage? So you're talking about things outside your app now. You're talking about things you can monitor on the operating system, both of you. Internal counters, we're going to come on to that in the next slide. What else do people monitor today? Who isn't Jeremy, because he knows the answers.
Memory?
Memory, okay, but that's more operating system stuff, yeah? The point I'm trying to get across is once we ring fence logs and say, please don't monitor your logs, there's not a lot left. Yes, there's the operating system, But as I'll show in a moment, the operating system doesn't have a clue what your app's doing. It only can see the side effects of your app doing. It doesn't know your business. And that's where these internal counters come in, metrics. How many who aren't Jeremy have metrics built into their apps today? Oh, dear. OK, so metrics are key value pairs. And the names are normally hierarchical. They're normally separated by dots so that you can group related metrics together for queries in dashboards and things like that. If you look at any library, I'll just wait for them to pass. Hey, it's a sunny day. Can't blame them having fun, can you? If you look at any metrics library, there's normally 5 or 6 standard types of metrics they do. But we're PHP developers, and PHP predominantly is a request-to-reply paradigm, almost uniquely amongst modern frameworks and modern languages. So there's 2 metrics that we typically use in PHP. And these are the 2 I introduced to my code bases. Counters, increment by 1 whenever something interesting happens. You know, customers made a purchase, increment a counter. Customers put something in the basket, increment a counter. How long has it taken to do something? So, okay, I need to, customers search for a product. How long did that take? Those sorts of things. Metrics that matter. Now, you can actually get some metrics from log files. I haven't been entirely fair there, but I'm not talking about your application. I'm talking about things like Apache and Nginx. Now, unfortunately, out the box, neither of them chuck out all of these metrics. You have to reconfigure your logs to get all these metrics in them, which is a shame. I wish they became a standard. But these are useful health indicators as well to get. And as people have said around the room, monitoring your host operating system and network bandwidth, things like that, can show you other points of pain as well. But the thing is, and the point I was making earlier, is your web server, it doesn't understand your app. It doesn't understand whatever business that app is there to do. And those are the metrics that really matter, because that's ultimately what's paying for the development of that app and its continued life, is it's serving a business function normally. So when I am taking over a code base and preparing it for disasters, I load it with metrics. I go through the business requirements, or failing that, I go through the Jira history, and I hunt out all the stories, and I create metrics for them and put them throughout the app so I can see what the app is doing. I don't have examples of specific metrics because they're unique to each business. Yes, there's some common ones like users logging in, etc., but they really should be tied to the business processes that your app implements and fulfills. Now, in terms of actually writing code for this, there's a de facto standard called StatsD, which originally came out of Etsy. It's been around, it's not quite the longest, but it's by far the most established. And even though StatsD and its ilk are dying off now, everything that's come along afterwards still supports it. The League have a package that does this. I haven't used that particular package, but I know the League stuff's popular, so that's where I'd recommend starting, to put metrics into your own. Now, you're going to need to send these metrics somewhere. There are people in our community doing talks on all of this stuff. Michael Heap's doing a talk later this month, so I can't link to his slides yet. But here's an earlier talk I found, which talks about a tool called Prometheus, which is the current in vogue system for capturing stats. The DataSif mob, I'm sure some of us in the past have talked about Graphite. We'll have presentations somewhere on that as well. But Prometheus is the one that's in vogue at the minute. And it's normally backed with a dashboard tool called Grafana as well. So assuming the QR code generator I used isn't dodgy, that should take you to the presentation on that. OK, you got it? Excellent. Now, what you get out of these are dashboards, instrumentation. And if you look at any other walk of life, when you go outside the tech bubble and you look at the real world and you look at the analog world, dashboards, indicators are something fundamental that's found everywhere in every other walk of life. The nice thing about dashboards is they can have warning lights. Because these stats are numeric, you can do statistical analysis on them. And so you can do things like, I want to know the 95th percentile, the performance of that. And if that's within outside a certain standard variance, let me know. So you can catch it when things fall as well as when things are rising too fast. And you can use this to trigger your alarms and waking your people out of bed at 3 a.m. or whatever's needed. Okay? You can do it with the numbers far more reliably than you can with the log messages. Does that sound all right? What do you think to metrics? Any of you likely to, on Monday, start looking into them a bit more?
One of the quick wins in this area is if you're using a framework that's following traditional MVC style of pattern.
Yeah.
Just a simple thing is if you start emitting metrics on every kind of pre-dispatch, where the first point at which you know the controller action, if you trigger every controller action with a metric going out just by one of the event emitter +1 type of thing, you can graph that, and very quickly you've got behavior of actual usage in your system, not the client who says, oh, we use that all the time. You've got evidence that says, well, you haven't used it in 3 months, so I'm not buying it, Mr. Client. You know, so just in additional aspects of life around the application that you're supporting, you've got evidence that you can use for other purposes than pure monitoring. It's monitoring over a different arc, a different life cycle. Just the controller action is the bare minimum you can add to any of the modern frameworks with a one place to emit from, because it's done at the framework level, not in the rest of your code. So there's only one place you need to do that. Obviously, over time, build that up and make it a richer playground. But if you just do that one thing, you'll suddenly get a much richer pattern of behavioral usage by the people using it, not just works on my machine.
But you would get less than you would if you used the client-side JavaScript application for tracing what was getting used, essentially, because you might have stuff that doesn't hit, that gets dealt with at the edge.
Sure. But if you've nothing,
Right. So the advantage of server-side monitoring is whenever you take those server-side stats and compare them to what Google Analytics or anything else is reporting, you will find they do not match up. Google Analytics does its best, but it does not give you 100% data accuracy. Whereas if you're monitoring what you are in control of on your own servers or your own applications deployed in the cloud, you can have a lot more confidence in those numbers. And those numbers can be, those differences can surprise you. So I'm working with a customer at the minute who is starting to make this transition. And one of the reasons for that is they know how much product they actually sell goods online. So they know how much goods they're shipping out. But Google Analytics does not telling them about all the checkouts. There's quite a gap. I think it's 5–10% difference. It might even be higher on some days. So
we've seen in the past, we've seen about 40% of analytics drop off of Google.
40%. Wow.
So we already use Grafana for a lot of our stuff.
Oh, excellent. So if anyone's seen any example dashboards, head over there. That's excellent. I think Jeremy's made a good point that I don't have a slide for. If you need to convince someone in your business to let you work on this, start by putting in the metrics that would get them interested and get them enthusiastic. And while you're at it, you can always slip in the metrics you need for when disaster is going to happen. Because to be honest, they're all the same thing at the end of the day. They're all the same thing. Okay. Now, I've been really down on application logs. So some of you may be wondering, well, is there any point to logging applications at all? Why don't we just switch it all off if we've got metrics? And that leads to the second outcome when I'm preparing a code base for disaster. Is when a disaster happens, I want to be able to find that problem very quickly. That's why we log. So I've got a question for everybody. How many people here or in your organizations have someone who, when there's a problem reported, goes, oh, it's going to be that, without giving them any detail or any information whatsoever? They just seem to just instinctively know because they've got everything in their head all the time. There's a few smiles. There's a few people seeing that, yes? Sorry? It's usually their fault. Okay. So I'm referring to these almost as like intuitive leaps, because for people who don't know, in the same office who don't know the system that well, it can look like voodoo or black magic, yes? You know, you wonder how the hell they knew that. It's just, they keep the system in their head, I guess. But here's the thing. Intuition's great until it's left the building. What do you do when they're on holiday or they've left the company entirely? That way of working can't be replicated by everybody else. It's unique to that individual and their brain, or that set of individuals. So it's my argument that it's not sustainable. How many of you here have been in your job less than 4 years? Quite a few, okay? So industry metrics tell us that people move on, permies move on within 4 years. And scummy contractors like me move on even quicker. That's a very short turnaround. Code these days normally outlives the person who wrote it. Unless you're writing little microsites, throwaway stuff. Normally the code outlives the developer. So you need a way of working that outlives that intuition. Because someone's going to be left holding the baby. And it might be you. Today you might have the system in your head. You might then go and work on a different project for 6 months and come back and go, how the hell does this work? I can't remember anymore. And as you get older, that becomes more and more frequently a problem. Let's be honest about it. Yeah? So what can we do about that? How can we replace that non-replicatable, individual-dependent, intuition-driven workflow with something else? What would you do? Cloning. I wish I had thought of that. That would have made a great slide. Well, I'm going to urge you to replace it with science. It's becoming more and more a controversial view in our industry, but I believe that we are software engineers first and foremost, not developers. We are people applying science first and foremost. And the scientific method is about evidence. It's about having evidence to hand that you can follow, that will lead you to the right conclusions. That evidence needs to be clear. It needs to be simple to understand, especially in an emergency when you're not thinking as calmly and as relaxed as you would be when you're solving a problem day in and day out, because you've got those people looking over your shoulder going, is it fixed yet? Is it fixed yet? Okay? And the other thing is we want to see what's going on inside the app. Superficial information's no good because our metrics will give us most of that anyway. We want the details. And that's where the logs come in. Logging gives us the information we need to do investigations. Metrics tells us we need to do an investigation, or the customer does if we don't have metrics. And then our logs is how we go and do the investigation and find the problem. So when I'm preparing a code base for disaster, the first thing I need to do is make sure the logs are actually consumable. I don't know how many of you are aware, but any of you who use any sort of log collection and management tools, they're all based on the behavior of Unix syslog, fundamentally. Whether or not they're text-based, whether they're actually logging in a binary format, they all have the same property, which is basically this. A complete log message has to fit on one line of text. You don't split a log message across multiple lines. You don't do this. Yeah? Sorry? This is how PHP outputs an exception if you don't catch it. Okay? PHP does this. Other languages, which I will not name, but we've all used, also do this. That's their default behavior. You don't want that because you can't, all these log tools, you start using the ELK stack to centralize your logs so they're easier to search and they're easier to make securely available. It will see that as 1, 2, 3, 6 different messages. It won't see that as one message. Now, I believe you can actually write collectors to tell it how to package this stuff together. But the moment you're starting to write config like that, it rots. So you want to avoid it. Fix it at the source. Now, for logging, hopefully you're all using Monolog. It's one of the few situations where there is a one true package for something for logging in PHP, and that is Monolog. Can't recommend it highly enough. And you want to use a custom formatter to make sure this is done. Because you want to make sure all line breaks and tabs, what you do is you convert them into their ASCII equivalent string to collapse them. Those of you who use Monolog will know its constructor does take a parameter to say, do this for you. It doesn't work, or it doesn't work well enough. So what you want to do is you want to override the replace new lines method in the logger, in Monolog with this. You'll see more of the class later on, and the slides will be online once I'm back at the hotel tonight. To make sure, no matter what is fed into Monolog, it goes onto one line. And the nice thing about this is you can easily expand them again when you're looking at logs afterwards. If you're someone who logs onto boxes and surfs logs, you can easily pipe them through a little script to reverse this. It's really easy to do. So that gives us logs we can consume. Without this, you're basically stuck with reading logs manually by eye. You can't use any sort of tools on them sensibly at all, in my experience. Now, I mentioned earlier structured logs. Now, what's a structured log? I don't know how many of you know that with Monolog, you can tell it what that line of text should be, how to format it. You give it a formatter. And this is the one I use. And again, the code will be online later, so don't worry if you can't see it. We're going to break it down. It's got 5 distinct parts, and I use a double pipe symbol to separate it. The idea is, if you're parsing these logs, you want to have, whatever your separator is, you want it to be something that's so unlikely to appear anywhere else in the logs, like it's not going to cause problems. And in my experience, double pipe is something that just never turns up in logs. But your experience will be different. So you start off with DateTime, because at the end of the day, it is a text file, and you want to be able to sort it. Now, if Derek was here, he would be telling us that DateTime is complicated. It really is. It's far too complicated for me to do it any sort of justice. But when it comes to logs, there is a convention that I've seen day in and day out, here and abroad and elsewhere. And that is to use UTC but as the timestamp. So year, month, day, hour, minute, second. Sometimes you want microseconds as well, depending on the nature of your app. And also put the timestamp in there, but always normalize the times to UTC. So if you're running multiple, if you're using Amazon, for example, and you've got high availability zones set up around the world to make sure your app doesn't go down, it doesn't matter which of those zones the message came from. When you collect them all in one place, you can see everything that happened in a good series. Gives you consistent timelines. So that's the first thing I do with DateTime. And I must admit, I do it by setting the server time to UTC and forcing everything to be that. Which is fun if you've got a machine, if your dev machine dual boots into Windows, by the way. Windows doesn't like UTC this time of year, because we're on daylight savings time, which is a pain in the arse for someone like me. Next thing is the log level, being able to tell these different messages apart in terms of severity. Please do not invent your own. This is, as with the nature of log messages being one line per message, this is something that's well standardized. There is no benefit inventing your own. Every log package out there almost goes through a rite of passage where they go, oh, we know better, we'll invent our own. And as it grows popular, it then has to crowbar and retrofit support for these standards back in. And Jeremy's laughing because he probably knows what I'm on about there. Today, they are documented in RFC 5424. Do you all know what RFCs are? Yep. For those who don't, they are Internet Engineering Task Force documents. They started off documenting the standards of the internet itself and have branched off into documenting pretty much anything anyone wants to write about. They've expanded scope enormously. But that's the current RFC as of the time of writing this talk, which was the weekend. So there's 8 levels, and use those. And Monolog supports all 8 of these, very pleased to say. So just use these. In production, you normally find that the app runs at either info or notice level and throws away everything below there. So if it's set at notice, it'll throw away info and debug, and they'll never hit your log files. I I try to run my apps at info level. And what I do at info level is I try to log things that are needed for audit purposes. So everything's gone well and you're being audited for whatever reason. Maybe you're working in a regulated industry, for example. You need evidence of how the app has worked. That's kind of how I pitch that. And then notice is a level I use when things are very busy and I need to degrade the log into save on disk space. Next up is the message, which is the bit we all actually think about when we write log messages. For those of you who write log messages at the minute, actually, what do you do for crafting this? Jeremy's already said he's got a dictionary, but what does everybody else use? Do you just use plain PHP strings in your app? Anybody? Yep, a few nods. Okay. I do things slightly differently. Because I want to plug data into these strings. So I use VNSPrintf, which takes name parameters, and so you can plug them in. So you can give it a PHP array of named data, and it will fish it out, and you can change the order of the data in that string, and you don't have to change the data you're feeding into it at all. Reduces the amount of change you've got to do. So I'll do something like this. It's a very contrived example. So I'm passing in a string, and it's got a parameter. So this is just saying a user's tried to do something that's unauthorized, and I want their username in there. And I literally just pass in a PHP array of what the username is. And that can be as few or as many parameters as appropriate for that particular log message. And that, I find, works very well, because if you are parsing log messages, or certainly if you're searching log messages, looking for things, having log messages that are consistently formatted helps enormously on cognitive load when you're searching for a problem and the pressure's on, in my experience. Now that array has a second use. I actually log that array separately as well. But what I also do there is that array will also have other pieces of data that may not make it into the text field, but are relevant for me understanding the context that that message is in. And I'll chuck any old thing in there. And what that happens is that gets JSON encoded as a JSON and gets put into that field in the actual log message. So you've got to be careful with it, because your text can be quite small, and the data can be easily 4, 5, 10 times the size of your actual log message. So you've got to keep an eye on this, because remember, bandwidth and disk I/O is not free. But this is really handy, because you can start writing tools that can read these logs and pull out these pieces of data as well if you ever need to help speed things up when you're doing analysis. And finally, IDs. You need to know who you're doing this on behalf of. Those of you who do log messages today, customer phones up and says, I've got a problem. If all you knew was who they are, could you find the log messages that are relevant to them today in your logs? Anyone? Jeremy can, a few people can. Are any of you writing logs, but you can't do this today? A few people? Okay. Now what I do is I actually put 3 tokens in there. How many tokens do you guys put into your logs in an ID kind of section? Depends on the app. Okay. So how many of you are logging these kind of things today? Maybe 1 or 2, but not many. Always number 3. Okay. Probably the event. Right. Okay. So I'm going to explain what these 3 things are. The first one, all log messages from a single business process. I often work on projects that use architectures like microservices, where to render a page, behind the scenes, there's 4 or 5, or in case of DataSwift, we had hundreds of services up and running that built that data and presented that page back to the user. And so you want to be able to track that request across all these different systems, because the fault may not be in the system that you think it's in, especially in a microservices environment. It's amazing how many microservices environments propagate faults rather than shut it down. I've got another talk elsewhere on dealing with propagating faults. It's actually the Edinburgh talk that I mentioned at the start. So there's a convention for this, and it's a HTTP header normally called XRequest ID. And it's normally a globally unique ID, so that you don't have any problems of synchronizing IDs. And it's a header passed around. So the first system the user touches normally generates this and includes it in a header in any back-end systems it requests from. And it's fantastic for going into the logs, because once you've found that request ID, when you're tracking down a customer's problem, you just change your search filter in your logs to look for everything to do with that request ID, and you can see everything your system's done, whether you realized it or not. And one thing I find with this is when people switch to searching in this, they're always surprised at what comes up. It shows them patterns of usage that were not in their mental model of how their systems worked at scale. Very, very handy. The second one is something that is already supported by Monolog, but there's a caveat about that in a moment. And that's on any individual web service, you want an ID for that single hit. That's unique to that, because sometimes you want to filter down to just, okay, we know they hit the authentication service and the problem was on there, so we just want to filter that down. And one way to do that is to find that unique ID and then have that. So this is something Monolog already supports. So this is unique to each service. If you have a microservices architecture, request ID propagates. This unique ID does not. It's unique to each of those boxes. Now, the thing is with Monolog, in my experience at scale, its current support for this UID generates clashes. It's not got enough uniqueness. So I write my own, and you inject this as a UID processor. Thankfully, we've now got this random bytes function in PHP that is cryptographically secure, which means it's random enough for things like this. Obviously, you've got to be careful about starving your entropy, but that's a different problem. Thankfully, I don't run into that problem myself. Again, this code will be online in the slides later for you to do this. But this is really good, because Monolog's already got it. You've just got to inject your own instead of using Monolog's UID processor. And the final one is who the user is. This might be a user ID. It might be an OAuth token. If you're using OAuth 2 on your systems, you might not have the full user credentials identity. You don't want to look them up just for your logs. You want to use what your system would already have needed in order to authorize them. You want to do the bare minimum. The last thing you want is your logging to be such an overhead that it becomes unviable for your app. You need to know who's done what in order to help you to find things. And the thing with that structure, with all those different parts of that log message, that log format, is tools like Splunk and all the open source stuff like Logstash that's come along since, they're all designed around filtering logs down to find a problem. And what these give you are unique strings to suit different circumstances to narrow down the logs to the ones that matter so that you can do your investigation. And you'd be amazed how often that is half or more of the battle of solving a bug, is actually having the right information to look at. It's not the whole battle, and we're going to come on to the rest of that in a moment. But that's very important. So that's why I log, and this is what I do to any app that I have enough control over to prepare it for disaster. What do you think? Does it all make sense? Does it all seem reasonable? Any questions about structured logging? Does anyone do it differently? Chris? Sorry? Just a JSON payload. So the whole log message is JSON. Okay. What third-party tools do you use to centralize and manage your logs? Sorry? So there's an Elk Stack plugin for that. Okay. Okay, so that's useful. That's very good to know. And that JSON payload, I assume that's structured internally. It's got a common format to it.
Yeah, it's got things like HTTP request status.
HTTP request status. Okay. Right. So let's talk about HTTP requests at the minute. I don't have a slide for that, What I don't know how many of you know, well, actually, let me ask the question. If you log HTTP request statuses, how many of you log it from your application? A few. How many actually monitor what the Apache or Nginx is sending back? Right. So is there anyone who only monitors the app and doesn't monitor their web server? No. That's good, because PHP lies. PHP has ways it will crash and return HTTP 200 back. So you cannot monitor that alone. You need to monitor both. It's handy to catch it out as well. But you can't rely on what PHP says. Same for timings. PHP has an overhead of starting and shutting down. And if you're using frameworks, that framework has a bootstrap overhead of starting and often shutting down as well. Which means if you're only doing timings inside your app and you're not also putting timings into your web server logs, you think your app is running fast while your users hate you and are moving their business elsewhere. And I have worked on systems like that. These overheads, to give you an idea, an app I'm working on at the moment, the bootstrap overhead is 20%. 20%, sometimes even higher, is not my code. It's before my code gets called at all. And PHP is pretty fast at this stuff. It's just if you're writing fast, tight code, these overheads can matter, and you can't see them if all you're doing is writing stats only from inside your app. So it's something to be aware of. Is there anything else anyone wants to bring specifically about logs before we move on?
We tried Logly with Monologue.
Okay.
And it absolutely killed our performance of the application. Because if you use Monologue's Logly plugin,
right.
so it uses TCP.
Because it's shipping.
Yeah.
TCP.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just, I'm amazed that it doesn't use UDP.
So I use Slack,
Yeah.
but we only come in at certain log levels.
Right.
So anything low level is in the logs
Okay.
themselves on the disk.
Yeah.
Right.
And we would then use Logstash or Logster or something like that to
Yeah.
ship it elsewhere for analysis
Yeah.
into an ELK type of stack like Logly
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
But then we'll use things that people need to act on
Yes.
come into Slack.
Right.
So that you don't want that interrupting your day.
No.
You've just got things going off in Slack. Obviously, you can hit TCP limits there as well. By that time,
Yeah.
somebody's already taking action.
Yes.
And we try and operate from the app that there should be no non-expected output from the app.
Yes.
So if it starts pinging into Slack,
Yep.
there's a damn good reason something's gone wrong.
Yep.
Therefore, take action now. And that's
Yep.
really what we engender.
Yes.
So, we've probably got 40 different Slack log channels.
Yeah.
And it's just for that. And most of them are quiet all day long. But then one will start, and then it'll have a cascade, and then it'll stop for a little while. People go, oh, it was nothing. And then 30 seconds later,
It'll start
bang,
again.
bang, again.
Yeah.
It's like there's a pending problem.
Yes.
So I find that logs are great when you're doing the investigation, as you've said.
Yes.
But whoever sits and tails logs as their day job goes
No.
and blows their brains out with it.
Yes.
And really, you need something because we use Slack for general comms.
Yeah.
We find that Slack is an appropriate place to put alerts that need to be actioned.
Yeah.
Obviously, the bigger scale we get, the more
Yeah.
that might be a little problem. But
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to iterate, expand upon from one point Jeremy just made. So first one is what I do. I don't have a slide for this bit. What I do with my systems is they always log to local storage, 100% of the time, because a system may be having a problem because it can't talk to something else on the network. But if you've got your logs locally, once you get access back into that box, you can get into it and see what has gone on normally if the box itself is still upright. And the second point I want to make, and I have got slides for that, but they're in my Edinburgh talk. Go watch the video. QR code at the front of the talk is your log messages. I am old-fashioned, Jeremy is too, but with good reason. Anything in your logs that's a warning or an error, sodding fix it. Your logs should be pristine. They should be spotless. You should be able to eat off your logs. So you all know who Richard Stallman is, I assume. If you search hard enough on the internet, you will probably find an argument with me and Richard Stallman over logging. and arguments about GCC and whether or not warnings should be fatal or not from the mid-90s. I cut my teeth as a C developer, and that's where I learned that you never, ever ignore a warning a system puts out because it's a bug. You are shipping a bug if there's a warning. And obviously, with the systems we have today, if you're seeing a warning in production, you have a fault. It may not be an application bug, it may be an infrastructure problem, but you have something there. And if you don't have self-healing systems, which do exist, you need to do something manually about it. It needs to be pristine, because what happens otherwise, it's like the idea of the frog or the tortoise in boiling water. Because the temperature rises slowly, it gets acclimatizes and gets used to it and doesn't realize it's dying. I think it's a frog, because otherwise, a tortoise can't hop out, can it? But a frog could. Yeah? So it's something to be aware of. You want it pristine. So and I always end up arguing with engineering management over this. I'm a great believer that that's more important than shipping features because it pays for itself. If you let this cruft build up, the cost of fixing that crud is often worse than little and often, because you can spread that cost out, in my experience. And Jeremy's going to, because he also has to make a payroll, was going to tell me something different.
The thing for me as well is as a developer, be personally disciplined to make sure you code with E all on.
Now, there's a dirty word, isn't it? Discipline.
Discipline. Well, hey, be good or be shit. It's one of those. There is no middle ground there. And it's like E all is designed to give you as much knowledge and make sure your code is clean with E all on.
Yes.
Do not have undeclared array index things because you're testing it before you checked if it exists and all that type of stuff. I might be very old school, but you know what? Defensive programming.
Absolutely.
This is a really lost art.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Rant over.
No, that's absolutely fine. Yes. And if you want to know how you can make your apps pristine and deal with these things, again, the Edinburgh talk covers that in immense detail. It's a 2-hour talk. It's got a lot of... I've uploaded the video in 9 parts, so you don't have to sit through it all in one go. Do go and watch it. It's got that covered in very great detail. Any more points on logs before we move on? Nope. OK. So the third and final part then, and the third outcome, when I'm preparing code bases for disasters. This one, when I explain this to people, management, they go, what? We don't want disasters. We want them to be anything but normal. But what I mean for that is humans, are you prepared? Because until AI replaces us, code doesn't write itself, and code doesn't ship itself. No matter what your continuous delivery process is, there is a human somewhere in that chain. Are you prepared for emergencies? Because as I mentioned earlier, when pressure's on, people act differently. And in particular, they revert to habit. So if they're trying to fix a problem in production, but they can't use the same behaviors they use in development all the time, they're going to be floundering. Because all of a sudden, all their tools and things they don't have to think about are gone, and they've got to consciously think about it right at the moment when they're least equipped to do so. So I'm a great believer in building these habits into your development workflow. So that, and this is what I mean by making these things normal. So an emergency is switching environments, not switching practices, fundamentally. That's what I believe in. What do I mean by that? In particular, I mean about how you go about debugging your code in development when you're writing new features. So Xdebug. Not code coverage, not call tracing, but how many of you use it for single-step debugging via your IDE? Too many? Sorry, Derek. Love you to bits, but it's teaching people bad habits. And the reason for that is this. How many of you run Xdebug in prod? Nope. There's not even any guilty looks around the room. Yeah? So you're all relying on a tool that you can't have when you're looking at a production issue in prod. That tool's not there. that crutch is gone, completely and utterly gone. So you then, if you are having to troubleshoot the problem in prod, you no longer have those habits that you've built up in dev. They're gone. So what can you do? If I take your Xdebug away forcibly, what can you do?
Up and die, yeah.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
In production.
In production.
Yeah.
I have done var dump in prod. Back in the days before it was easy to have third-party packages and consume them, you didn't have access to high-quality loggers. This is what we did. Well, okay, does anyone do anything more constructive? Chris? Call out to syslog. Right. So why don't you use the metrics and logs that we've talked about then? Why not use that? Use them in dev. Use the same tools in dev that you're going to have to rely on in prod to solve problems. Have your logging working in dev. Have your metrics working in dev. You know, I mean, thanks to Docker, we can run large architectures these days on ultrabook class laptops. You don't need the best Apple's got or the best Dell has got. You can take something with 2 CPU cores and not a lot of RAM with Docker and do all this stuff. You don't need, you know, you don't have the overhead of 10 vagrant bit boxes these days. So why not do this?
Don't tell finance that.
Sorry?
Don't tell finance.
Sorry, I forgot about that. That's one disadvantage of being your own boss. Is I control the IT budget. There's another reason for this. It's not just about building these habits. It's also about actually building the quality of your logging. If you're having to use the logs rather than Xdebug to understand why your app's not working when you test the code in dev, and I don't mean your unit test, I mean when you point your browser at it or what your API client like Postman if you're developing APIs, if you're using those logs yourself and you're improving them all the time, when disaster strikes, your logging is going to be in much better shape and you are going to be in much better shape because you are used to using those logs and those logs have good coverage of the information you're likely to need. And then you're prepared and you're able to shift environments. I mean, there's obviously a difference with working environments because you've got to be careful not to drop the database and things like that. You know, things you do in dev, you've got to be careful of. But it's setting you up for success by having an alignment in your working practices. So I do not use Xdebug at all for debugging applications unless I'm desperate and I'm having to use call tracing to figure out, for example, how parts of WordPress work, which is normally where I end up using it. Because it's a rich app, it's event-driven, you can't read the code to understand the code flow. You actually have to log it somehow. And that's where call tracing comes in. It's perfect for a system like WordPress, which is built different. But for our apps, where we can control the workflow more and use a less event-driven development, why not start that? Are there any objections to doing this, other than the fact you really rather like Xdebug and Derek's your mate?
It's not just it's like monoliths like WordPress. It's like could be any composer library you might not want to be hacking or might not have objection points for you to start.
Right. I have a slide for that in a moment. But are there any other objections who's not Jeremy yet? Rick?
Well, just for speed of development, it's very useful just to step through the code as we're developing it. When you know it's not working, just to make sure up to the point.
That project you introduced me with at the start of the talk, some of the developers on there benchmarked me against everybody else. And in their opinion, not mine, this approach, I can iterate over 5 times faster than everyone who is using PHP Storm and Xdebug the way you're talking about. I was way faster with this approach. And it's perhaps no coincidence that problems in production often came to me rather than them. And eventually I ended up actually taking over one strand of the program to sort it out. And I actually moved from simply being an advisor to actually leading part of the program on the technical side. So I've made this work for me. Doesn't mean it will work for everybody. There's no silver bullet. There's no one size fits everybody. I need to make that clear. And I've been doing this for decades. Because I used to work on Unix systems which were crashing all the time. And that's where I started this habit 25 years ago. So I've got a lot of practice in this. But you can be way faster than single-step debugging. And also, sorry, Jeremy, I will come to you in a moment. Half the time, if you're doing single-step debugging, you actually should have a unit test covering it instead. I'm going to strongly argue that a lot of the time you're using a single-step debugger because you haven't got appropriate testing. I'm going to challenge you to prove me wrong on that. Now, some of you will be able to do so because, again, blanket statements don't apply 100% of the time. But in my experience, normally, a single-step debugger is being used where a unit test is better. Again, before Jeremy.
Would you use the same kind of logging tooling in Dev then? So you have all your dashboards and everything set up in Dev?
I would do a mixture. Dashboards for metrics, yes. Without the dashboard, there isn't an easy way to get at the metrics, to be honest. For logging and log collection, possibly not. I'd probably just tail the logs because I probably wouldn't run a distributed architecture as much in dev. So the logs would naturally be in a place where I could easily log onto the box and tail them. If I was running a larger architecture, then I would actually put that management zone in there as well and those tools. But often you find you don't need it. I'm a great believer you should do it because if your developers are deploying these things all the time, you stop things rotting because you catch problems early, but you don't have to.
I'm going to come back on what you've asked just to follow up. One of the things that seems to be a lost art is the ability to use the Unix command line for its prowess whilst you're tailing logs. So there's nothing wrong with tailing piped into grep.
Yep.
So you're just getting the context in the logs that you're looking for. And the number of people I come across, especially when they're maybe fresh grads or only got a couple of years experience, who have not got a Scooby about what that is all about and how to actually proactively use what they could perceive as noise and actually filter it down. And so for me, learning that in dev, where I just go, right, what's your logs telling you? I walk the floor and I'm the annoying bastard boss who comes along and goes, what's that problem? Oh, you've got red on your screen. Why? Show me your logs and all this sort of stuff. And if they can't say what they're doing, what the context is, and how to narrow that down so that they're just focusing on what they're trying to solve, then go back to, debugging 101 and start over because you've really not understood it.
So what Jeremy's talking about there is a skill known as isolate to eliminate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, you may have heard it called divide. Well, sometimes people call it divide and conquer, but it's kind of normally used in a different context these days.
You can also generate quick metrics using that method as well.
Yes.
So just being able to use a grep MWC, just to know how many lines there are.
Yeah.
And actually creating double lines to compare the output to all the output.
Yeah.
It's not to generate percentages.
Yeah.
And the other thing is when you're doing structured logging, if you've got a structure to it, org is your friend at that point as well. Because you can take it and pipe it on to other things. It's just there's a whole rich set of stuff there that doesn't get taught in college. And until you've been out in the real world on systems, and those skills, while it's great, we've got all the elk stack and all these things, which is great for pretty graphs of what's going on. When the world's on fire, those are the skills that you'll need actually in prod.
Yes.
And so I fully agree, and I'm now getting on to my original point, which I'm not praised for, which is that that world where you are used to dog fooding your own stuff on your own machine that comes through into prod is absolutely what people need to be familiar with. But I still think Xdebug adds a lot of value, especially for mentoring context, especially on legacy systems that you haven't been able to add that refinement yet to. When you're trying to understand the system and actually work out what the hell it's doing. Xdebug and the way it exposes that is a tool that's without measure elsewhere. So I wouldn't ever throw it out, and it's still very much part of my repertoire. And I'm probably not quite as seasoned, but I'm in the same peer group as you in terms of seasonality and doing this sort of stuff. And basically get away with saying you're a bit older than me. Actually, I'm not sure that's true.
You're substantially older than me, young man.
Almost got away with it. But it's a part of the repertoire. But if it's the only tool you're using to fall in the trap of, then absolutely you should have a month where it's banned and you learn something else.
Yes. And I think, I mean, Derek, sorry, you're not Derek, you're Jeremy. You are reinforcing my point that there is, you can't make blanket statements. Yeah?
I've used XDebug in the past where I'm working on a monolithic system that has 0 unit tests.
Yes.
And I'm using XDebug to work out if I need to use reflection of the unit test I'm about to write. And it comes in very useful
Yes.
things like that. I'm trying to work out the scope of something and how I'm going to approach testing for it.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense. But when you're developing new code, I have a challenge for you. Try the XDebug diet. Yeah. Introduce logging and try and reduce the amount of XDebug you rely on instead. Use your logs.
100% coverage.
Sorry?
100% coverage.
No, seriously, you're breaking your architecture if you go for 100% coverage. That's a whole lot.
I have a talk on 100% coverage. That video will also be up at the weekend. I did a talk in Glasgow July last year. So that video will also be up at the weekend. If Apple cooperates. So maybe not. Is there anyone who's going to go away and go, this is not for me. This is utterly not for me. This is never going to work in my environment. Logging's not the answer. I'm sticking with XDebug. Anyone willing to have that debate? Because you will be seeing things I have not seen, and I want to learn from you as well. Okay.
I can't let go of XDebug when I'm using Drupal every day.
Okay.
It's like, what the fuck are you going to pass me this render array? I can't go back and go for an hour right there.
Ouch.
Even with Drupal, it's far better.
So I wonder how much better Drupal would be if it did all this logging instead. If it had good.
It would be even slower.
Well, you say that.
When I was
I do wonder.
Good practice I've seen with using logging, if you generate some logs, so you mentioned the issue that you had with logging before, the way we've got around that issue in the past where I work is, I believe we tried to use that approach, but what we're doing is using syslog daemon,
Yeah.
just throwing it into that instead of letting an agent put those logs for us. It does mean that you lack a bit of latency to your logs, but it's not too bad that it's going to make much of a difference when you're debugging it.
You can always put your logs on RAM disk as well. If you're absolutely up against the wall, I've done that.
That's not what I do in emergency. You just start to tap that passenger going all in there.
Yeah. Done that. Yeah.
The other problem with bugging this into Drupal, which does actually log a whole workload of stuff,
Okay.
is that even if we did put core on development of Drupal on hold, but on web and update it, put as much logging in as we could to do that, we couldn't actually force the Contrib ecosystem to do the same.
No, but best practice has a habit of spreading. It's contagious. As a community, if the community adopts it as best practice,
Yeah, like best practice doesn't.
yes.
I can give you a million examples where best practice in Drupal has not spread through.
yeah.
I'm sad to hear that. I really am.
But it's a massive community. There's a mix of approaches and attitudes.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm still sad to hear it.
You got it, Matt.
Oh. Yes.
I think the other thing to be aware of, those who might have been around for a lightning talk I did a few months ago on aspect-oriented programming and stuff, is that equally try not to fall in the trap of just injecting your logger everywhere in your app. Try and do it in ways that they become built in the core of your app, not that it's suddenly being injected all over the place, because you end up really polluting your app space with things that can be done in a slice through the entire stack kind of manner.
I have a talk on that coming up in Sheffield, which is just over the Pennines. Is it Sheffield?
Yeah.
No, I'm doing that one in Aberdeen, sorry, which is a bit further away. Sorry.
Just over the Pennines, the other way.
Yeah, but that talk will also be videoed, but I've got an answer for that I will be sharing at Aberdeen in August. Okay. Anyone got anything else on logging? Yes.
I'll do on XDebug again.
XDebug. Okay, yes, please.
I have to say, I was back in my previous life.
Your
in
previous
Aberdeen,
life. Okay.
All of 7 months ago. I used to introduce Xdebug to students
Okay.
because otherwise they were doing var dump and die
Yep.
at every point.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly slow for them to figure out what it was that was going on, and they found Xdebug a revelation.
Yeah, as a teaching tool, absolutely. I mean, I started as a C programmer, and single-step debugging was the first thing the people who taught me hammered into us. Until you have this single step through your code, you don't know what it's doing. Because back then we didn't have unit tests. But these days, hopefully you can get your students, and I know you don't teach them anymore, but hopefully if you were teaching, you'd be able to get the students to the point where they can switch to writing unit tests to understand the code, I would hope.
Yes.
I live in hope with these things. Anything else on logging and Xdebug before we wrap up? No? Okay. So the final section of this talk, I want to talk about actually getting your fix out the door. We've talked about preparing your code base so that you know there's a problem, so that you've got the information available to find the problem without having to rely entirely on intuitive leaps and that person in the office who just seems to know everything about the system all the time. We've also talked about building up habits so that when the pressure's on, you're used to working in a way that allows you to make good use of all this preparation. But once you've found the fault and once you've fixed it and you're ready to ship, shipping under pressure is also an interesting thing. So I want to give you a set of questions to take away, and maybe we'll debate those down at the bar afterwards rather than here as a group. So the first question for you to take away, and I'm not looking for answers today, is how quickly can you ship to prod when you have to? That's the first question. If you've got people stood over your shoulder saying, ship this now, how quickly, once you've found that problem and fixed it, how quickly can you then say to them, it's gone, it's live? That's the first thing to think about. How long is that gap? And how long is that gap costing you as well? If those of you who work in businesses that take money online, and also those of you where support time is coming off of paid work for new features, it's still a cost, even though you're not actually handing over money there and then. Now, our development ecosystems are way more complicated and have way more moving parts than when I started in the industry 20 odd years ago. There's a lot of moving parts, and quite a lot of these moving parts are involved in building, packaging, and shipping, and deploying. So how many of those can you switch off in order to speed up your deployment times when there's an emergency on? How many of those moving parts are not important in an emergency? Can you switch them off in order to save time? Have a think about that. Some of these moving parts are designed to reject delivery. They're designed to actively stop delivery. They will stop a push to Git. They will stop a merge request being merged. They will stop a build happening. They may not be code, they may be people. It may be you don't have authority to do the merge. You don't have authority to get to the page to hit the deploy now button, and you need someone else's time and availability. So what safeguards are there in your shipping processes? And which of them will stop you being able to deliver in an emergency? Can you bypass them? If you had to, if you were the only person around, and you'd be amazed at how often in emergencies there's one person who has to solve the whole sodding thing. And I don't just mean find and diagnose the fault, but like one person has to get it out the door and all the way through. You'd be amazed at how often that comes up in organizations of all sizes. If you are that person and you're on your Todd, can you do it? Or are you going to be stumped? Those of you who have a build box, CI box or CD box, chances are it's quite busy. Chances are, can you push your emergency to the top of that queue, or can you delete everyone else's jobs and stop them submitting? Or are you going to be stuck at the back of a queue while 20 other jobs run through? I've seen that happen many, many times. And we all know the XKCD comic with the two people jousting in the hallway. They shout back, oh, it's the CI box running as the reason why they've got time. You haven't got that in an emergency. You've got to be able to do it. Here's another one. In an emergency, your CI box may be part of the emergency. It may not be available to you. Can you ship from the laptop that you work on day in and day out? Especially if you're being called and you're not in the office and you're working remotely. Yeah? Can you ship from that laptop if you had to? Is there a way to do that? You may need that capability. And testing. I am a big advocate for testing. The more testing you have, the slower that test suite takes to run. Do you need to run all of that test suite in order to ship safely in an emergency? Can you shrink it down and run and cherry pick parts of the testing to prove you're not making things worse in order to ship? Normally the answer to that, to be honest, is no, because apps tend to be big balls of mud and not well architected for that. But if you start thinking about it in those terms, it can help your application design as well. So that's just some food for thought for us to debate over in the bar afterwards, rather than cover here and now. It's the logical extension. And we're starting to get into almost ITIL and IT service management territory rather than code bases, which is why I'm not covering it in detail in this talk. I could happily, those questions, I could do a whole day workshop on that, for example. So what do you think then? Have I convinced you all? Nope. Preaching to the converted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Me, it's finding time to make a change because I'm really not my own. I have to do everything.
Okay. But the nice thing about this, though, is it's iterative. You can start, once you've got your logger available, I mean, there's a setup cost of making a logger in your system. And if you have to start somewhere, start with structured logs rather than metrics. I would prefer both, but because metrics absolutely needs those dashboard tools as well, those collection tools, whereas logs you can get away without them, there's a bigger setup cost. But start with logs, and even if you just got one log message, just write one log message.
Generate metrics from your logs as well.
Well, I've talked about that and my opinion on that. I strongly advise against it. Put proper counters in, my advice. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure to come up here. I just want to finish by saying, for someone like me who's been doing PHP before all these user groups were up and running, it's my opinion that PHP North West is the most important user group and has had the biggest impact of all the user groups in the UK. So it's a real honor for me to finally be up here and talking to you all at the user group rather than at the conference. So thank you for having me. You've been a great audience.
Thank you.